We're going to take a look at early Japan. This would be Japan prior to the late feudal period known as the Tokugawa period. Let's look at how Japan saw China, because China is very close to Japan. You can see over here on the map, Japan here is in green and China is in yellow, and it's fairly close to China. Now, in the 600s is when Japan began to look towards China for guidance. In fact, Japanese nobles would be sent directly to China to learn as much as they could from China and bring that knowledge back to Japan. Now that exchange is going to last for like 200 years. So during that time period, from the 600s through the 800s, students, monks, traders, and even government officials went from Japan to China. And then they learned in China and went back to Japan. Now, we need to understand the concept of selective borrowing. Now, Japan was very good at this. So Japan selected the best parts of Chinese culture while preserving their own unique identity. The idea of selective borrowing is unique to Japan. They're very good at it. They continue to do it today. So, what happened in China? The things that they borrowed from China, one of them is that they adopted the title of Heavenly Emperor, and they claimed absolute power for that emperor. So, the Chinese had an emperor. We saw the emperor, like let's say in the Tang Dynasty, the Empress Wu. So, the Chinese basically set the model for the Japanese emperor. And so in Japan, they too adopted that title of Heavenly Emperor for their own emperor. The Japanese also borrowed the idea of a capital, Nara, modeled on the Tang capital of Chang'an. So here's a map of Chang'an from about 750, most famously because it was laid out in a grid-like fashion, and we know it was at the end of the Silk Road, and it was a very important city at that time period. And so in Japan, they built Nara. And Nara was also laid out as a grid, and although not an exact copy of Chang'an, the idea that a grid-like city would be the capital of your centrally located government is something that the Japanese borrowed from China. They also borrowed the idea of writing, Chinese characters. So in fact, in the early period of Japanese history, to be able to be literate in Japanese meant that you actually could read and write Chinese. So these characters here, over on the left, this basically says in Chinese, 日本话, which is basically the phrase for Japanese. And so later on, Japanese will develop its own unique characteristics in writing, but early in its history, it basically used Chinese. They also adopted Buddhism, but they retained the traditional Shinto beliefs. So Buddhism had its origins in South Asia, India and Nepal, and it eventually spread to China. And then from China, it spread to Japan. Now, the Japanese had their own traditional religious belief known as Shinto. Shinto was a belief system that existed in Japan and did not come from someplace else. All right, so let's go to this next period then in Japanese history. It's called the Heian period. It's from 794 to 1185. And during this time period, the imperial court moved to Heian, which is actually the modern-day city of Kyoto. So these maps on the right here show where the cities were, the city and actually the imperial city nearby. So this is, again, a grid-like city adopted from the Chinese model. But this is the Heian period because this is the time period in which the capital was located in the city of Heian. Now, during this time period, nobles followed and created a highly refined culture. So we have to think about how we see sort of contemporary Japan today as different than what Japan may have been just 100 or maybe 150 years ago. But during the Heian period, there were lots of rules and regulations about dress and behavior and the sort of etiquette that nobles had to live their lives by. So the samurai class basically lived their lives very differently than commoners. This isn't too different than what was going on in Europe at the same time. Again, nobles didn't live the same life as peasants and serfs. Now, in the Heian period, gentlemen and ladies followed elaborate rituals and artistic pursuits. And we can see the women often wore their hair really long. And men and women were generally forbidden to basically see each other. That's why in this picture there's a curtain that separates the man on the bottom left from the two women in the room. Also, proper etiquette and appearance was really important. So, for instance, women wore their hair down to their ankles, long straight black hair. They also blackened their teeth with cosmetics, so that was a sign of beauty. They also had to dye their clothes to match seasons. So depending on the season, their clothes would be very colorful depending on what the season was. They would have very dark teeth, and they also would wear very heavy white makeup. And this would have been considered signs of beauty back then. Remember, a woman with light skin was a woman who basically stayed indoors all day and pursued artistic pursuits. She was not out working in the fields. If she was out working in the fields as a peasant, she would not have light skin. She'd have tan, dark skin, and that would be a sign of her poverty. So light-colored skin becomes a sign of wealth and status. That's why the sign of beauty and wealth and status was to have a very white face. All right, now everybody was expected to write poetry and paint. Now be careful, when I say everyone, I mean everybody within the noble class, basically the noble samurai class. So poetry and painting, artistic pursuits, were very important to these people. Also, the nobles looked down on common people who did not participate in the court refinement. So court refinement was that refined way of life, the way they dressed, the way they made their appearance, the types of activities they engaged in. Commoners didn't do those sorts of things. Commoners worked. All right, we're also going to take a look at what's known as the Great Wave at Kanagawa Namiura. It's from the 36 Views of Fuji, and it's a woodblock print that was created by Katsushika Hokusai. He did this in 1823, so it's not really a painting, it's a woodblock print, but it's pretty famous. And even though it dates from a much later time period, it gives us an idea about how people in Japan traditionally have viewed things like the arts as a special reflection of how they value the world. So here's the woodblock print. And again, it's very famous. Most people look at that, they see the Great Wave, they see that there's guys in boats. Here's one set of boat with some men in it. Here's some other men in a boat right here. There they are, the men. Here's the boat. And there's a third boat over here. Some guys right about here. And then in the back you can see Mount Fuji. Now you have an assignment in your journal in which you're supposed to answer a few questions to think about what you see here. So take a minute and do that. And what I want you to think about too is the last question asks you not what you see, because the first few questions on that activity ask you to think about what you see and describe what you see. But the last question is sort of a Zen Buddhist question. And the idea is, don't tell me what you see, tell me what it makes you feel. So what Japanese people might say when they look at a print like this is very different than what, let's say, Americans might say when they look at a print. People in the West, Westerners, tend to look at this and think about an ominous wave that's going to come down and destroy everybody. People in Japan might look at this and say, oh, these are people that have to go out on a daily basis and face an obstacle that needs to be overcome. And maybe not even overcome. That nature is important. It's an important part of this image. And essentially the people have to learn how to live harmoniously within nature, because if they don't, they could be overwhelmed by nature. They can't necessarily control it, but they do have to learn how to live with it.